Hello, fans, collectors, and investors. Welcome back to Iconic Baseball. I'm Iconic Al, and we're back to the countdown today at number 49. For real this time. I am proud to present one of the great left-handed pitchers in baseball history. In fact, I have him ranked fourth among all left-handed pitchers all time, behind Lefty Grove, Randy Johnson, and Sandy Koufax. This man was the ace of those world champion Philadelphia Athletics teams of the early 1900s. He has 3 world championships to his name. His career ERA of 2.35 is just ridiculous. He amassed 90.8 WAR over his career. He won 326 games. And I can't wait to dig into this guy. He is well known in vintage circles. However, I think among mainstream fans and collectors probably doesn't get his due. I'm talking, of course, about the great Eddie Plank.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and cracker jack. I don't care if I never get back. Let me root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
Mr. Eddie Plank is one of the great lefties in baseball history, one of the great pitchers in baseball history. He was the first lefty to 200 wins, and then he was the first to 300 wins. Among all left-handed pitchers, he's number 1 all-time in shutouts with 66, and number 3 in wins at 326. He amassed a 90.8 WAR over his 17-year career, from 1901 to 1917. His ERA was a ridiculous 2.35, and his WHIP was 1.119. He had a phenomenal 122 ERA plus. And just to elucidate how different the game was back then, I'll just leave you with this. He started 529 games, of which he completed 410. He was a 20-game winner 8 times. But he really set himself apart by what he did in the postseason. He was a 3-time World Series champion, although he only pitched in 2 World Series, 1911 and 1913. In 54 World Series innings pitched, he sported a 1.32 ERA and a 0.878 WHIP. Sadly, Eddie Plank passed away from a stroke in 1926 at the age of 50, making his autographs essentially impossible to find and extremely expensive. For that reason, I have targeted for my collection a Playing Days 1909 or 1910, depending on who you talk to, E91B American Caramel Eddie Plank card. I'm very proud to own this card, one that I never thought I'd be able to own, but here it is. Just a beautiful example. It's an SGC2 in the old slab, the old label, and just a great pose of Eddie Plank, almost that collared style of jersey, of uniform, holding a ball that looks more like an egg in his left hand, and the Athletics logo across his chest. Edward S. Plank, pitcher, Athletics, AL. A little bit of off-centering, a little bit of rounding on the corners, but for a card that's about 120 years old, that's pretty darn good. And the back, you know it's old when it says baseball. Back in the early days, it was 2 words, not 1. And these featured players from Chicago, from Philadelphia, and from New York. Some of the notable players in this set include Mordecai Brown, and Eddie Collins, and Christy Mathewson. So there's a couple key cards in this set, this being one of them. Eddie Plank cards have sort of an aura to them. I think because of the T206 Plank, which is extremely expensive, extremely limited and rare, and one of those grail cards in the hobby, much like the Wagner, a little less so, but has a similar aura around it as the Wagner among vintage collectors. I'm also a big fan of the Cracker Jack, the 1914 Cracker Jack card of Eddie Plank, but he's got a lot of great tobacco era releases, many of which are well outside of my price range of what I can afford. I'm just really thankful to be able to own the one Playing Days plank that I own. And this is one that I'll cherish in my collection for as long as I'm around. But yep, this is my pride and joy. Now, one thing that a lot of people that deal in pre-war don't often talk about are the populations. And so I've done a little legwork here. And what we have when you look at the PSA population on this card is they have graded about 28 total of this E91B plank. Of the 28 PSA graded examples, there's only 12 graded higher than a 2. And SGC has graded 37 of this card. Of those 37, only 8 have achieved higher than a 2. So we're talking between PSA and SGC combined, we have 65 total graded examples of this card in the world, which is pretty cool. And of those, 20 have achieved higher than a 2. So we're talking about a card that is, in my opinion, extremely important and beautiful and of its time. I like how those little columns and rafters, you can see the posts and the poles behind them holding up that roof of the stadium. There are some, which I can see the rationale, that don't like this set because the artwork, it seems to depict a childlike aesthetic, and if you see enough cards from this set, you'll realize that they aren't actually depicting the individual player that you think they are. For example, I did some digging and found that this card can be found basically replicated in another card of a player named Tom Hughes. So Tom Hughes was another pitcher, apparently another left-handed pitcher, that this, American Caramel Company basically used the same photo, the same rendering to picture him. So clearly they didn't do a lot of diligence in rendering each individual player because they all look very similar. They kind of used a non-specific, childlike face and changed the jersey, changed the uniform, may have put the glove on a different hand. In this case, they used the same exact pose as Eddie Plank. So it's not a set that I would want more than one card from, but I'm very happy to own one card from this set because I think it is kind of a piece of Americana, a piece of pop culture from the early part of the 1900s, and I'm over the moon to own it. Again, thank you all for watching. It's been an honor to share my countdown with you and my collection. If you are into the all-time greats, I highly recommend following along and subscribing. And until next time, keep collecting and stay iconic.